We are recording.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming this evening. Ryer Appeldoorn is our featured modeler tonight. And as I said before, Ryan is an artist, and he brings this training and his viewpoint to his modeling. And I think you're really going to enjoy hearing what he has to say and seeing his models. And with that said, Ryan, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So my name is Ryer, and I'm a model maker, and I kind of don't restrict myself to scale. I'm sort of all over the board, and maybe you'll see some of that tonight. I'm going to share a lot of pictures. I am a formally trained artist. I went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I also taught scientific illustration. I actually have 3 degrees, and so each one of those sort of brings in a little, or informs a little bit the different type of, or informs my modeling in different ways. But tonight, I'm just going to focus on sort of the artistic side of things, and how being in our institution and everything like that sort of informed the way that I built models, or the way I build models. It kind of starts with my first year at school. The School of the Art Institute of Chicago is a very conceptually heavy school. It focuses on sort of the idea of art making and postmodernism and all this stuff. And I'm an illustrator, so there's a little bit of a clash there. But one of the things that I noticed, and it kind of became a pet peeve of mine, was when my peers would get upset about having assignments, because they would say, "Oh, how are we supposed to express ourselves creatively or share our own work if we're following within the rules of someone else?" And I thought that to make your own work and have it stand out and have a fingerprint of its own, and still be following someone else's rules, is actually more creative, and it shows more creative skill. And so as I went on through school, I started to kind of think, well, before I start building anything, before I start painting anything, designing anything, I'm going to set a set of rules for myself, and work on those rules to sort of force myself to be more creative. And sometimes those rules are obvious, like if you're doing a painting or a drawing and you're working within a certain size format of the painting, right? That's already a constraint. It's already a rule you're working with. Other times it's arbitrary. I did a collection of work that used model cars that I had designed and built, and I just, for some reason, said they all have to have red wheels, and working within that sort of informed the design of the project. But then as I started getting back into model railroading, I never really left model railroading my whole life, but as I started to get more serious into it, I started to kind of think about putting rules together the same way I would for a painting or a drawing. And I also thought about, there's a model railroader named Bob Symes, Robert Symes. He used to have a TV show called Model World, and he had a beautiful Gauge 1 model railroad, and he had rules that he had put together. Railroads have to serve a purpose. You can't just have a railroad for the sake of a railroad. A train should never chase its tail, right? A realistic railroad has destinations. And then I think my favorite of all of his rules was railroads are built from the things that they run through. So he had this garden railroad, and the bridges were built out of slate that he had pulled out of his own yard, because that's how railroad works. And so I started following sort of the same pattern and building rules for myself. And what I realized pretty quickly what I was doing is I was actually generating a story, and sort of designing the world that my railroad's going to fit into, which is no different, I think, than most model railroaders, except I'm not interested in reality. So instead of picking a world where a narrow gauge railroad might exist or something like that, and then figuring out how to chop it up and constrain it so it fits within my budget and my location, I'm designing my own world from scratch. And that lets me get weird and kind of explore some of the weird stuff that I like to explore with. But it's all about storytelling. And so it's not necessarily, I'm not building a model railroad or stuff like that for the sake of building the model railroad, but for the sake of trying to build this world. So I'm just going to, that's sort of just a basic context of what I'm doing when I'm designing or building a model. And so I've got this slideshow presentation that's an example of some of the different models I've built. The first few pictures are not model railroading pictures, they're model cars that I've built, but they give a little context to the type of style and the type of things that I like to build. Kind of the 2 big things, I like weathering. I like stuff to have personality that's gained from use. So lots of rust, lots of crust. I also like a lot of color, and it might not be realistic, it might not be prototypical, but I like to have color. It's part of the things that I like. And I think I can use both rusty metal and dirt and dust and mud and color to help sort of better tell a story or establish what I want something to look like. And I also use a little bit of the color theory from painting classes and a little bit of the composition from the drawing classes to sort of figure out what my things are going to look like and what colors they're going to be and everything like that. But all of this goes towards the same goal of always trying to use these rules and use these practices of art making to end up telling a story or having something that can be a subject matter as part of a story. And all of these different little models are kind of examples of that. Working within model railroading, which is of course matters more, for this group, I started to use when I first started getting back into model railroading. I started doing stuff that was weird intentionally. I didn't like that there were rivet counters who were saying, well, they would never be like that in real life. And so I was purposely trying to make stuff that would irritate people. So I had this Dreyfus Hudson and I painted it purple because I had done a painting of a purple Dreyfus Hudson. So I thought I'd have a real world version of that. The painting is old and outdated and the model I don't think ever got finished. So, whatever. But I also started working in a hobby shop when I first got out of college and I was done teaching for a while. And, I normally don't want to build anything military. I'm not interested in that at all. But some guy wanted some military stuff for his rare, and these aren't necessarily accurate, but it also introduced me to this idea of other hobbies help inform your model making. So if you get really into military modeling or, gaming modeling, there's a whole different set of skills that you can glean from those hobbies that help inform your model railroading. And that's sort of what these were an intro to. Quickly getting back to the storytelling thing, I have a couple examples of other model makers who use the story they've built to help inform the models they're making. My friend Jake, he and his friends sort of came together with this idea of a railroad. I think it's called the Blue Mountain and Southern or something like that. But it's a standard gauge railroad that exists in the modern day. And they've purchased old, outdated equipment and they've updated it and used, put modern equipment onto it to make it so it can run and do service in the modern world. They started by designing everything in a video game. I think they used Gary's mod. And now they've finally gotten to the point where they're starting to build things. And I love using Jake as an example because he sort of poo-poos the idea that the hobby is going away, because I think Jake's 19 and he's already one of the best model makers I've ever met. And he's using sort of this outside frame, not only, I mean, he likes traditional model railroading too. He's collecting every single piece of rolling stock the Pennsylvania Railroad ever had, but he's also trying to these weird projects where he's trying to make these modern interpretations of older engines using modern equipment on old equipment. Another friend of mine is Chris Wallace, and his stuff might look a little weird, especially when you compare it against a real world prototype. But when you start comparing it to other examples of his work, it all starts to make sense within his own timeline. So the things that he's making in his shop and in his backyard make sense in their own world. They make sense in their own story that they're telling. And if anyone's interested in either Chris's work or Jake's work, we do have a Facebook page called Raucous Rails. And that's all about just being totally weird in model railroading. And so if you like scratch building, if you like kit bashing, if you like going over the top or telling a story that's your own story you want to tell or whatever, you might want to check that out. Both these guys post a lot of work as well as a few others who do some pretty cool stuff. But Chris's work is always fantastic and it's weird. So when I really started getting really back into model railroading, it started with my acquisition of a 7.5 inch gauge railroad. I purchased it from a friend who had passed away from his estate. And it came with this 1.5 inch scale standard gauge F unit, which is being reworked. But the pride and joy of the collection for me was this Allen Models 10-wheeler. Live steam, runs off propane. When I got it, it didn't really work, and it didn't really interest me in the way that it looked. It's standard gauge. I like narrow gauge. I like older stuff. It's relatively newer, supposed to be. And I like stuff to be really colorful. I don't really care much for black steam locomotives. And yeah, like I said, it also didn't work well. So I knew I had to rebuild it anyway. And I had this really rough sketch that I had put together of something that didn't really exist, but I wanted some sort of justification for it. And that's where I started putting these rules and trying to figure out the story. And I started to build out this idea of what would later become my 0-30 railroad and some of my F scale or 120.3 scale stuff. And that's also when I started using a laser cutter to take some of my parts and figure out how to build them in real life. So, and that was really handy because instead of drawing something out and then cutting the parts out, using traditional methods and doing traditional woodworking to build stuff, I could just cut them out real quick. And if I don't like them, well, I haven't invested that much time, so I can make it an iterative process. So yeah, I started rebuilding the engine. I started repainting it, trying to think of things of how I wanted it to look. And I kept repainting it and redesigning it and remaking new parts for it. And I learned pretty quickly that it's really expensive to do that on a very large scale. And it takes a lot of time. And it was sort of one of those duh moments where it's like, oh, I've used a laser cutter to make some of these parts. Because of CAD software, I can just scale my stuff down. I can just make a smaller model out of more affordable materials and a more affordable scale, get the looks right, and then once I get the looks right, I can scale it up. So I purchased a laser cutter for my company, and then on the side, I've been using it for just starting to rebuild that locomotive in a smaller scale. I've got done the wheels and the frame. But growing off of that, another model railroader, David Fletcher, is a wonderful historical model railroader, and he does a lot of work with researching paint schemes as locomotives came out of the factory, specifically Baldwin, Mason, Hinckley, older, more decorated engines like that. And in 2002, he ran a program called, or he used, for a while, he ran the master class, where it was, we're going to scratch build or kit bash a historically accurate model. And in 2002, they built the Mason bogie. And so I started working with him to find those old files and then also figure out how I could use the laser cutter and use modern technology to sort of build these things the way you would have done with more traditional means not too long ago. And this is the parts for the Bully Boy, which is a real 066 Mason bogie that did exist. I'm never really ever build historically accurate stuff, except David's a historical model maker, and I didn't want to take him off too much by building something weird, which is the other one that I'm building. And this is a weird one, and it's got that recurve roof that I'm just obsessed with. This will be a 266 with the long extended tender box that some Masons had. And these are all in F scale, 120.3. And I got this idea in my head that, oh, I could be scaling these things, but I can build them any size I want. And as I started figuring out the story of the Lakeshore and Wizened Oak, which is my railroad now, I realized that 0-30 is probably the right scale for actually building all these things in. And so I scaled down again. And oh yes, I've started building one in 0-30 as well. And there's not much going on yet, but none of my projects have really been finished lately. Also, I mentioned earlier talking to Jim, I am starting to learn to do some 3D modeling stuff, because in this scale, in 120.3, you can stack discs of styrene, you can sculpt them, and you can use a lathe or whatever and turn domes and other parts that will fit and look fine. But as you get smaller, that gets trickier and trickier to do. So using 3D printing, I can do the same thing as I would with laser cutting, but these are the domes for the steam domes for the Mason bogies. So that continues on. I love chopping up stuff that can be built one way or can be bought one way and making it look different. I want stuff to never look like something that you could purchase. So when I got a hold of one of the early prototypes of Dylan's Porter conversion kit, I knew that I wanted to build this version of the Hinckley locomotive aerial, just because it's this strange 2-foot gauge cab forward old engine. And so it became that. I got Dylan's kit and I immediately started chopping it apart, taking off a lot of detail parts, building my own cab. And
I will say this: it's come out very good so far.
Thank you.
He took it a lot farther than I expected anyone would ever take it. And considering it was a beta kit, the idea was to, cover my costs and build it and see what you guys think. And Ryer basically took that to an extreme I never would have expected, and I can't complain. It looks excellent so far.
Well, thank you. But that's also one of the things I'm really excited about with kits like Dylan's coming out, because I think these simple locomotives or these simple kits that exist are ripe for kit bashing. And I have examples of them in lots of different scales. The AccuCraft made a live steam Ruby for 45 millimeter gauge, and it's a very basic live steam engine for introduction, but you can do all kinds of amazing things with it. And my 10-wheeler is sort of the same thing. It's not a very advanced, very complicated steam locomotive, but you can really make it whatever you want. So once I started building stuff in ON30, I was like, well, I'm going to build my own rolling stock, and I want a lot of rolling stock, so I'm going to design it as kits, so I can build kits for myself and make things work the way that make them look the way that I want. And I started to try and design things. This was my first, what I thought was a successful model. It was a flat car, obviously. And then I started building other things. I built all kinds of stuff. This is one of my more recent projects. It's not painted yet, but I love that recurve roof. I'm kind of obsessed with it. And so I thought I'll put one on a boxcar and see what that looks like. And I liked it quite a bit. Well, I have a laser, so I was like, well, heck, I'll build a big one too. I can just scale the file up, no big deal. And so because I make these things as kits, I can batch mount and build as many as I want. So yeah, I like my little recurve boxcar in ON30. I might as well build one for F-scale as well. And that one's coming along fine. It's a little tricky because some stuff doesn't scale properly, but it's a fun project. But once I started building that boxcar in F-scale, it's like, well, I might as well start building all kinds of things. So I built this caboose, or I started building this caboose, and I painted it green just because, and I built this flat car. It still needs detail parts applied to it. I love using traditional materials and traditional techniques in conjunction with the laser. So like I've tried doing things like getting weathered wood grain and then engraving the pattern onto plastic, and it just doesn't look as good to me as if you take a razor saw and an X-Acto blade and you scrape up plastic. You can make really convincing wood. Weathering's not done on this yet. I don't like it, but I like the deck. I think that looks okay. And you can put stuff on it. You can push it by an engine. It starts to look kind of convincing. It starts to look kind of fun, and it also lets me have all kinds of the colors and the dirt and the rust and stuff that I would want. And the most expensive thing on there are the Heartland trucks, which were $10. So, I'm not breaking the bank either. Other things the laser have let me do. This is a really rough model that I built, I think, in 2007. And I put it together with hot glue because I didn't know what I was doing. But my friend Bruce Bates had designed this kit to be available. And I remembered it, and I thought, well, that was a laser cut kit. Maybe I'll make a new version of that because I want to rebuild this model, but I also want to build a B unit for it. But then a friend mentioned that he never got a chance to buy one, and now that Bruce has passed away, you can't get him anymore. And so it was really easy to redesign that kit and rebuild it, so you could, build I had friends who weren't able to purchase it could now build that model that they couldn't before. And while I was at it, I built an ON30 version so I could have it run my road as well. So that's a lot of rambling, and if you can just interrupt me. But this is some of the other stuff. So the scratch building is one aspect of the railroading that I really love doing because you can make whatever you want, and it's totally up to you what rules you follow and what you do. But one of the other things that I really love doing is taking cheap toys and low quality models and building something that could be passable or semi-passable or semi-realistic or whatever. This is a Kalamazoo Locomotive Works American, and it is a toy, and it's old and it's outdated, and it's ugly. And I had bought it for I think like $5, and I was like, what am I going to do with this thing? And then eventually I stumbled across this drawing of an Australian locomotive. It's a Queensland class A12, if that means anything to anybody. And I was like, well, I might as well cut up the Kalamazoo. So I added length to it, stretched it out, filled it, put a new boiler jacket on it, and I've started trying to make it look like something that's a passable model. The trick is going to be, I've gotten this far, and I've now told myself that anything that I build in, focus is terrible on that, anything that I build in F-scale now, I also need to build it in ON30, so the trick's going to be actually finding a donor mechanism for that. Mm-hmm. This mentality I also get carried away with every once in a while. I read a lot of books about model railroading, especially older books, and I I kind of got obsessed with the idea of super detailing and kit bashing, because I like the idea of taking, like I said, I like the idea of taking something cheap and modifying it. So this was actually for an HO scale project that I was working on. Bought a broken down cheap Mantua Mikado and sanded almost everything off of it, and just bought a ton of detail parts and then kind of forgot about it. So the last thing, the last thing, and this is my most recent obsession, and the thing I'm actually getting close to actually having finished examples of, is this weird scale called GN15. I don't know if anyone knows about GN15. It's sort of like the ultimate narrow gauge. It's 1/24th scale models of 15-inch gauge prototypes. And I was reading a lot about Sir Arthur Heywood, who kind of came up with this idea that the most narrow you can go and still have an efficient, real working railroad is 15-inch gauge. And his ideas never really caught on in the United States, but I wanted to start building models of what if they did? What if instead of fairground rides and amusement parks, 15-inch gauge was actually used as a workable model. And so I started using some of the same designs that I put together for ON30 and for G-scale and building some freight cars. So I built this flat, and I've got to plant grass in there still because I really like I said, I really like stuff that's beat up and damaged. Started working on a box car, really tricky, trying to get stuff to look good and also work out in scale. And trying to figure out how to make all this stuff work because it's a really narrow gauge. And most people who build GN15 are building very narrow, like mining engines or something whimsical or something like that. These are pretty big. And so getting them so they still work on HO gauge track, here's an example with the locomotive that I'm working on, a little 040 saddle tank. But getting them to work is proving to be the difficult part. It's actually taking some real modeling skill, and that gives you an idea of the scale. It's all the same gauge, of course. I'm sure you recognize those engines, but it tells you how big some of the GN15 stuff is. And this last slide here is just an example of my nightmare. Every single project that I build is totally an iterative process, and I will build a car maybe 10 or 15 times and work out all the problems by building, because I think actually building a model and actually knowing how to build things helps you build a better kit. And there's a lot of broken and not working and things that didn't come together stuff that are just around my shop, but it's helped me become a better model maker, become a better designer. And that's everything that I do. A little all over the place, but that's me.
How do you get the weight right for the cars and so forth if you're building them all out of wood?
Well, so a lot of them I build using layers. So instead of having a flat sheet of styrene or wood or something like that, and then carefully laying all the planks, I'm actually cutting layers of detail and then laminating them all together to get the look I want. And that weight adds up pretty quick. Styrene and ABS plastic are actually the material that I use more than anything, and they've got a lot of weight in them. And I actually end up having to figure out how to remove weight more than having to add it. If I do have to add weight, I do it usually one of two ways. Either I build a load that is pretty heavy and just have a load that you can pull around, or I use liquid lead or something like that, and I can hide it in the frames.
What's the material that you use for your locomotives?
All styrene. Everything is sheet styrene. I buy it in 4x8 sheets and then just cut it down for what I need.
The frame and everything.
Frame and everything. Well, some of the frames are most of it is just laminated styrene. Some of the stuff I'll use ABS. It's a little hardier of a plastic, but it's still styrene based, so I can glue it with styrene adhesives really easily. I am working on doing a couple metal frames for some of the bigger engines that need more weight. I don't have the tools to cut the detail that I want here, though, and so that requires a little more investment to get that to work. Yeah.
So, when you're looking for a model,
Yeah.
You know, I like I said, you picked up one of the beta kits for the Porter 40 that I did, which is basically just a Bachman Porter, strip it down to just the block, put a new boiler on it, new frame. I didn't expect you to take it the way you did when you first
Right.
came. And I guess my question is, do you usually see something and go, I need to do that or do something like it? Is there actually something, or is there basically a thought process that goes along with it?
There's very rarely any type of rhyme or reason. But it kind of goes both ways. Sometimes I see a model sitting on a shelf that's for sale, and I just think, oh, it'd be really cool to do something with that. So you posted actually your vest pocket 280, just started playing with, and my thought was like, oh, that could be something really cool to work with. I like the proportions of that design, so maybe I can figure out how to make something work in that. Other times I see a locomotive that I know existed in real life, and I try and figure out how would that be used in my layout, why would that be used in my railroad, or what version of it. So in the case of that Porter kit, I'd been looking for a long time to figure out how to have a really simple 040 chassis that I could then bash and modify, because I wanted to build that Hinckley engine. And then now that I'm doing it, I also have a couple live steam G-gauge engines. I've got some the AccuCraft Ruby, and it's like, well, I want to build an 0130 version of that too. So I know now that I'm working on that Hinckley engine, I can use your kit to build those as well. I think the one of the interesting things with model railroading from early on is it was sort of the original maker's hobby. You had to know how to do a little bit of everything to build a working, functioning railroad. And you couldn't just be a model maker. You had to know how to do carpentry, you had to do bench work, you had to do electronics, and you had to know how to lay tracks so it would be functional. And I there's still that appeal, I think. And I think it's going to be really interesting as technology progresses and things like laser cutters and 3D printers become more affordable, what people are going to start to produce and what interesting things we might see.
So here's a question for you.
Yeah.
And this is something that I like to ask people, or at least I want to try and ask people, I should say. How did you get into the hobby to begin with?
Well, I've always liked trains forever. You know, I don't know why. There's some appeal to it. And then when I, like in high school, when I started, kind of thinking, oh, maybe art is the direction that I'm going to take, I naturally just wanted to paint locomotives and draw locomotives, because there's especially with steam locomotives, they don't hide anything. You can look at them and kind of figure out how they work. And there's all this sort of stuff in the progression of humans and the progression of countries and societies. It's all tied to the railroad. And so what started as a really simple, I'm a kid who likes trains, has kind of evolved into this sort of like weird anthropological love of railroading equipment. And I think the most attractive thing to me is not the stories of railroads themselves. I've never really been interested in like the Pennsylvania Railroad or Denver and Rio Grande or anything like that. The thing that's interested me more than anything has been the actual equipment, and then the relationship that the people who operated that equipment and worked on that equipment, the relationship they had with that equipment. And so trying to learn about that and learn about those stories has kind of kept fueling me through all this time.
Well, I'll tell you what, I remember how I first got involved. My aunt took me into Boston from Worcester. I was like 3 years old. Walk on the platform at Worcester Union Station, and you see this thing that's like 10 times your size, and
Right.
I just went, oh shit. I just had an oh shit moment. And
sorry, go ahead.
But from there, it was once that brief terror was out of the way,
right,
it developed into a fascination. For a long time, I was just like, oh, I just like trains.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to really figure out what about them interested me so much.
Right.
And I think for me, and I think this might be true of a lot of people, is someone built that.
Right.
It's true
Yeah.
of it. That's true of a lot of the things I look at, whether it be a fighter jet, whether it be a battleship, whatever it is, someone had to build that. Someone had to figure out how to build it. Then once it was built, somebody had to figure out how do you run it? How do you maintain it?
Yeah.
What about all of that? And to me, that's an entirely human story.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually,
We never hear about the people who, in the drafting rooms who come up with these locomotives.
I just finished a really interesting book called The Most Powerful Idea in the World. And it's all about steam technology and how the steam engine sort of started with Hero's engine, and how through the progression, not only did we have full industrial revolutions and railroad companies, but like the patent system was invented because of steam technology. And it's actually the story of the people who designed these things and got them to work. It's really interesting.
What I think makes me sad is you don't see more of who these people were.
Right.
History didn't record the who. It recorded the what.
Well, and I think
that's kind of sad, because some of these people must have been fascinating individuals. And there are some that were, history records the larger than life people.
right.
It never records the little guy that contributed, that made a major contribution to a project. It always looks at those larger than life figures. Lee Iacocca at Chrysler comes to mind. He was a larger than life figure, but I guarantee you he had a whole staff of people who was working on cars for him at Chrysler.
Right.
You got people like Otto Kohler, who was an industrial designer, or Kohler, however you pronounce his last name. If I'm butchering it, I'm sure someone will yell at me later. You look at that, and history records the larger than life people. Now, when you get into those smaller railroads like the Sandy River, you get more of the people.
Right.
Like, what did they do while they were there?
Well, and I think there's a lot of the early stuff of railroading is not around anymore. It didn't get preserved, right? There was so much like stuff that it burned up or whatever.
It was burned up. They scrapped in a scrap drive. I mean, that's how we lost the Denver and South Park and Pacific, however you
right.
The South Park engine. That's how we lost their Mason bogie that was preserved.
Right, and that's what. But one of the things that is interesting is like even the documentation is gone, and so we have sort of this idea in our head of like the steam locomotives are either the classic American 440 Western engine, or they're these big black behemoths. And it's for a long time in history, the standard 040 Porter saddle tank, when Porter first introduced them, they didn't come out of the factory black and beat up. They actually came out of the factory green, with gold and silver lining. But of course, through use something like that, they've gotten erased. So we the fact that we can't even hold on to that information, how are we going to hold on to the stories of the people who designed these things?
And that to me is a tragic loss.
Yeah.
Because think about it, how much we run into this in ON30 a lot. Is there was a lot of huge design, larger than life figures that I'll occasionally hear their name, and it's like, I've heard that name before, but what did he do?
Right.
Well, we've got a group on Facebook where we're trying to archive everything.
Right.
So people can come back and look at it.
Well, that's
but
one of the things.
The problem is how much did we lose? We'll never know how much knowledge we actually lost in some of these hobbies.
Right, and I think an example of that is William Mason. For anyone, the Mason Locomotive Works is absolutely insane, and I've learned this through kind of as I've been building this Mason bogie project that I've been working on. There's only one preserved Mason bogie left. And it looks absolutely nothing like how Mason made things, because Mason, not only was he sort of this big, over-the-top, grand, funny guy, but he also was obsessed with craft and obsessed with stuff being assembled properly. If memory serves right, I think there's actually only 2 Mason locomotives left in preservation. There's one at the B&O Railroad Museum, and there's one at the Greenfield Village, which is the Mason bogie. Mason stuff, not only was it meant to be beautiful casting, beautiful assembly. They were also painted amazingly. He paid really close attention to art movements that were going on at the time. The arts and crafts movement was really big, and so all the adornment and filigree that were on the bogies were all built from the arts and crafts movement. And he was obsessed with design, and so he really didn't like the look of counterweights on the drive wheels. And so for things like the Mason, he had drive wheels that had hollow spokes, and then some of them were filled with lead, so that way he could have full rotational symmetry on his locomotives. All that stuff is not preserved. I mean, only recently was the William Mason locomotive at B&O. Only was that recently repainted to the way it was actually supposed to look. It was just kind of forest green for a while. Now it's this really funky, cool, like almost lime green. But the Torch Lake Mason bogie came out of the factory as this really cool, like emerald green engine, and now it's totally butchered and totally been rebuilt pretty heavily, and just kind of looks like an everyday tank engine.
That's basically what it looks like.
Yeah, and it's like you wouldn't know that's the first articulated locomotive in the United States. Totally designed around the Farleys on the Festiniog Railway, and that it used to be this really huge, glorious thing, and now it's sort of what it is. Now it's of course it's also gained its own history since then. It's become its own personality, and now it exists as something outside of just a Mason bogie. It's got so much more going for it, I think. But yeah, it's weird that it's difficult. There's no preservation of the original,
and that's sad because I mean, look at like I said, it comes back to what we lost.
Right, but I also don't know. I think the fact that it allows for interpretation is also kind of a good thing, because now you've got people who can invest in actually figuring out what did these things look like, what color were they supposed to be painted, how were they used, and even though I think the ideal, of course, is to have the real thing, being able to take the time to do that research, I think actually helps preserve the idea of the hobby, or preserve the idea of what we're doing, maybe a little better than the real one actually existing. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, no,
like a
it does
wacko?
make sense.
Yeah.
So, while I've been dominating some of the questioning, I'm sure some of you guys also have some questions for Ryer.
Ryan, you
was
going
actually
to...
kind of. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go
Well,
ahead.
I was curious about your painting style on those automobiles you did.
Yeah.
Were you actually weathering them before you assembled them?
Yes. So there's, a lot of people like to do sub-assemblies or things like that when they're building models. I hate masking. And I hate it. And so it's like, okay, I've got all my parts. I might as well paint as much as I can now. And I know where these parts are supposed to go, so I know where rust is going to build up. I'll do all that weathering beforehand. Then I'll assemble everything, and then I'll do my final layer of washes and chalks and all that stuff to kind of blend them all together. But when I'm building a model, I usually paint the entire thing before it comes together.
Yeah, I've seen painting pieces the base color, but I've never seen the weathering done in advance.
Yeah.
You're sacrilegious. Sorry. I don't want to talk to you anymore.
I'm used to that, so that's fine.
This is an interesting idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, I actually like that idea.
Yeah.
Because, if you got stuff, how hard is it going to be if you're building a model car? How difficult is that going to be to make something in an engine bay and weather that?
Exactly.
You'd have to do it before you put it in there.
Well, I've done a lot of work with there's a steam museum about an hour and a half away from me called the Heston Steam Museum.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, and they have a lot of projects. They had a fire, and so a lot of their engines were damaged, and they've slowly been rebuilding everything. They just finished a 260 Porter. Got that running last year, but you've got all this stuff laying out for so long, it's gonna weather on its own, kind of laid out and knolled on pallets already. And so if you're building something like a rat rod or like a project that's been rebuilt over time, you kind of actually get a little extra layer of realism by weathering it beforehand, because that's what would happen in real life.
Ryan, you planning to produce any kits for production?
I have actually produced a few kits for production. It's mostly been people like me who are like, they've got one particular thing they want built and they want 10 of them. I had a friend who wanted a specific outside frame boxcar. He had all the plans. He had kind of everything laid out. And so I worked with him to design what all the parts were going to be, figure out the prototype, and then do a short run just for him. My only hang up with producing readily available kits is that where the laser is great for making the body parts and the big parts, when you start getting all the little detail bits, that gets a little trickier. You can use laser board and you can do engraving, but you can never really make a part like a Grant line part like that. And so I'd just be selling pieces of plastic to people, and most people just want to cut them out by hand anyway because that's the traditional way of doing things.
Gotcha.
I think if there was more interest in some of the weirder stuff like GN15 or some of the weirder ON30 things I've done, there could be potential for a kit thing there. That being said, I don't see a lot of interest for recurved roof boxcars. So
well, it kind of reminds me of the curly roof vans that the Festinian Hog did.
well,
That's what that kind of reminds me of.
right. Well, and then the main 2-foot stuff. I mean, a lot their engines were some of the last to have a recurve roof style cab. That were never actually designed to build that way. So I mean, the stuff is out there. The stuff exists. It's
a small fraction of what was actually out.
Yeah, and the stuff that I'm building is only loosely tethered to it. So
You talk about the rules that you developed, and that kind of lost me. I don't know what you're really talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So the rules, like I said, the rules really quickly kind of turned into I was actually building a story, building the world, but they were I put rules in place so it's like if I'm building a string of locomotives or a string of cars, I have to have a certain set of rules. So that way they all look like they're being made by the same manufacturer, or they look like they're being used in the same operation. So one of those rules might be if you're going to do a type of weathering, there has to be these set of colors because they're all existing in this same space together. So you have to use the string of colors. Or these are all being used around the same set of time, so you have to use this type of font because that's the font that would have been used during this block of time. And by having those things, it seems obvious if you're modeling a real prototype, if you're modeling the real world, because like say you're modeling Denver and Rio Grande, there's documentation of what design style they used and when. And there's also documentation of what the world is like, so you know what kind of weathering to do. But because most of my stuff is my own world, it's freelance. I have to make sure that all those things look like they should exist together, and so I have to set up a set of rules for the world, so that way they have a uniform look to them.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense now. I understand.
The challenge that is getting carried away. So, like I mentioned, I did this project where I was using model cars as illustration, and for some reason, arbitrarily, after about 2 months of playing the thing, I just said they all have to have red wheels. And you have to kind of recognize when you're doing stuff like that, is that rule for a reason, or is it just because at the time you think that's a good idea? And that ended up being a real sticking point for me, because you end up limiting yourself if you've got this one color you have to use for a project. And you can do the same thing in railroading. If you say, well, they all have to use this type of fuel because that's the fuel they use, you're limiting yourself to a type of locomotive to build. And so if you think, oh, I really want to build something that doesn't have a balloon stack on it, well, you have to start breaking your rules or something like that. So you have to kind of figure out which of those rules are necessary, which ones are needed, which ones are applicable to the thing that you're actually building, and what others have you put in place because you think it's a good idea or because you think it'll lead to a cool final product.
Gotcha. All right. Anybody have any other questions? Ron, I can't thank you enough. I've learned a lot from you tonight. I had no idea about
Yeah.
No, I have rules because I freelance too, but I had never really thought about them in those terms before. And I really appreciate.
I think now that I'm at this point, I think it's more appropriate to say have a story, and the railroad shouldn't exist just for the sake of there being a railroad. There should be this thing that it's doing. There should be a part of the story is the railroad and what story you're trying to tell. I think that's what it's come to more than just being rules, you know?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. All right. Well, listen, I can't thank you enough, Ron. I really do appreciate it. And I think you've really added a lot to my knowledge tonight. Next Wednesday, Alan Littlefield is going to be our featured modeler. And Alan has a request. Alan builds an awful lot of models. And if anybody would like to see a specific model that he's built or hear him talk about how he built it or why he built it and so forth, if you could let either me or Dylan know, then we'll consolidate that information and try to pass it on to Alan before his appearance so that he can try to narrow down and talk about the things that people would really like for him to talk about. And with that said, unless anybody has anything else, I wish you all a good evening and please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Likewise.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting.
Thank you so much. Dylan, you around?